Hello, IT heroes. Today we are going to go through the process of complete export of a group policy from Active Directory, doing a report of that group policy as well, purging that group policy, and then going through and restoring it completely to demonstrate a process of how a group policy can be retired, archived, and then in the case of consequences or if that policy is needed later, recreated very quickly and very easily. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So what you can see in front of you right now is the Group Policy Management console that I already have open on the screen. I've already gone ahead and created a Group Policies folder on the desktop here where I'm going to be going through and saving all of the configuration and report and everything else to as well. One major thing to keep in mind on this is why I'm going through and saving this on the desktop of the server just for demonstration purposes, but of course best practice out there is going to be to save all these files in a common location, keeping a backup somewhere that is stored with the rest of the archive data or in a backed up location so that in the event of a failure of this one server, that of course you're not losing all of those group policies, settings, and everything else that you're trying to do with. So definitely just doing this as a demonstration here, but follow best practices when actually doing this in a production environment. So currently highlighted, you can see I have a very simple environment here, and right now I'm just focusing on the workstation settings group policy that you can see here. And this has just a couple of really basic settings I threw in this, for just controlling a few things about the start menu, desktop gadgets, and some settings for Internet Explorer. Nothing in particular, as this whole process that we're going to go through right now is going to export the complete settings of any type of group policy and any type of settings that it might have. That does include any additional ADMX definitions that you have imported into your environment for controlling things outside of just the Microsoft world. So, for example, if you've imported ADMX definitions for controlling Google Chrome policies or Citrix or any multitude of different things out there, the same process will work on going through and exporting all of those, as the standard process is just well understood by Windows Server and Active Directory. So no worries about compatibility if this is going to work in your environment or not. This is universal across any kind of Active Directory domain. So let's go ahead and get right into the actual process here now. So one thing that you're going to notice right now is I have the workstation settings policy highlighted that is linked to my IT computers OU in Active Directory. If I right click on this, I just have some options to control what happens with this group policy as it applies to this current OU. So if I wanted to disable the link for this or enforce this policy on this OU, or if I wanted to delete the policy from this OU, I would use any of these options here. But I want to point out that how going through and selecting the policy from the OU level does not give us all of the same options as if we were to go into the actual group policy objects directory here. Here's the same workstation settings policy that is linked to the IT computers OU. When we right click on this here, we have a whole other set of different options. Most importantly here, we have the option for saving a report and backing up this policy. And that's what we're going to be going through right now. So our first thing is we're going to go ahead and save a report of this policy. And what a report of this policy does is effectively creates an HTML page that looks a lot like the settings tab here in Group Policy Management. And I like to go through and do not only an export of the policy, but also saving a report, as it's much easier to go through and know what that policy was doing and review the settings than having to go through and import the policy from the backed up exported settings and reviewing it in Group Policy Management. Without the report, that's basically what you would have to do unless you wanted to dig into the XML files and everything like that. So doing a report when going through this process is a very good idea, as it will save a lot of time and trouble later on. So we're going to go ahead and right click on the workstation settings policy here. We're going to choose the option for Save Report. And that's going to ask us where we want to save that to. And like I said before, is we're going to come over to our group policies folder here. I'm going to create a new folder here for everything for this particular policy that we're doing here today. I'm just going to name it after the policy. So workstation settings. And I will leave the default name on this here, and we can see here saving as an HTML file. You can also save it as an XML if you really wanted to, but I think HTML is a little bit easier to work with, at least for the general purposes of what we're doing here today. So we'll go ahead and save that now. So now if I go over into that file, into that folder, and we open up the workstation settings file here. Yeah, this is my default environment here, of course, so get a couple of those standard pop-ups that Microsoft always puts on. But if we come in here now and I click the show all, we see here is the complete export of all the settings as part of that policy in a really convenient HTML page. So that way later on you can see very easily everything that this policy was set up to go through and do. Nice thing about this also is it goes through and it will list out all the links where this is actually put into the environment here. So you can see right here that it's linked to my IT Computers OU. So later on when you're going through to restore the policy, if you need to, you can use this list to know actually where to create all those links again. So here's the report, but the report isn't particularly useful for going through and recreating the policy later on if we ever needed to, though it could be done manually by simply reading the settings from this report and manually going through and creating a new group policy with the same settings. But an easier method of going through and doing all of that is to simply export the actual settings from the policy, which we can then later import if we need to. So once again, selecting the workstation settings policy here under the group policy objects directory here, we're going to right click, we're going to choose the option for backup, and it asks us basically the same kind of question here. So I'm going to navigate over to the same location, that workstation settings folder. Description, I'm going to call it workstation settings. We click backup and boom, there we go. So now if we go back into our folder, there is the report that we created before, but then here with this set of characters and everything here, this long string, if we dive into this, then we see the complete export of what this policy was and all parts of it in a way that group policy management understands. The way that it goes through and creates this is, notice how it just does this long string of characters here. This is why I like to create a dedicated folder for when going through and doing this. That way it makes it really easy to identify which policy is which later on if you need to. So now we have a report of this group policy. We have the actual policy itself and all settings exported here. So we're going to go back over to group policy management now, and I'm actually going to delete this policy from my environment. So we say OK on the warning here, and boom, that group policy is now completely gone out of my Active Directory environment. So we've gone through, taken a report, backed up all the settings for the policy, but let's say that there's some kind of consequence where it turns out that we need that policy back, or we've removed that policy now, but some situation comes up later on where we actually need to just bring that policy back. That process is very, very simple to do. It's effectively the reverse of what we just did. The only step of that is a little bit confusing to understand in the beginning is you do actually need to create a group policy first to be able to import those settings too. So I'm going to go ahead and under group policy objects here, I'm going to choose new from the menu, and I'm going to call this restored workstation settings. Now you can use the original group policy name, of course, assuming that no new policy has been created since then and is using the same name. Your group policies do need to have unique names. So I'm just choosing a restored workstation settings for this demonstration right now to help those navigating through the video to be able to tell the difference of the original policy and the restored workstation settings policy now. So we go through and we do that. And when I select this policy under the settings tab, which is still loading just immediately for us, we see that there are no settings that are part of this policy yet. It is completely empty. So if we want to get those settings back from that original workstation settings policy, all we need to do is, again, under the group policy objects menu here, right clicking on this policy, and we're going to choose the option this time of import settings. Now there's also restore from backup, and I'm pretty sure that is going to look for just a specific policy by the original name. I like to just use the import settings here because it's more universal. I think the net result of the two are always going to be about the same in at least most scenarios. So I'm just going to use the normal method here of the import that I'm typically just using throughout my regular processes. I'm going to choose our workstation settings folder here, and we're going to say OK. And when I say next here, what it's going to see is our workstation settings policy. All that gibberish from what it looks like from just looking at the file source and everything there. We've selected this workstation settings folder as the folder containing the settings, and what Group Policy Management sees is this directory here and this string of characters, and it understands that this is an exported group policy object and contains all of these settings, which is how it's resolved it to this here. Now, an interesting thing about this is you can actually have multiple versions of these group policies exported to the same location. So if, for example, I had another change I made to my workstation settings policy, and I did another backup of this to this same directory, it would create more objects and more settings underneath our path here. And then when we went to do the import wizard, we would simply see multiple versions of that same policy, each with a timestamp of when those were actually exported out here. So I don't see that as being a terribly useful feature, but if this process is something that helps you to go through and modify group policies and then restore previous settings should an issue occur or you need to, then absolutely power to use that setting. Personally, I prefer to just do individual exports per iteration of the policy and per policy, but that is simply a preference by individual. So we're going to go ahead and continue here by selecting our only option, the workstation settings policy here. And it doesn't contain any kind of particular security principles or UNC paths that aren't compatible for our environment, and that's something to be aware of and just know is important. If you export a group policy from one domain and try to import it in another domain, most of the settings, more often than not, are going to work and apply just fine. But any specific settings that were created for that domain, such as accounts that it was set to apply to, or specific directories or paths, or any number of different things that are specific to one domain, will need to be modified to apply it to a new domain. So something to keep in mind, going a little bit off topic with that. In our use case here, this policy came from the domain that we're importing it from, so we don't have to worry about any of that at all. So we're going to go ahead and hit next now and finish our wizard. Restored workstation settings has succeeded. And now it automatically refreshed our console, and when we hit show all here, we see all of our original settings are restored. Now, what I want to point out is notice how the settings for the policy are restored, but if we go over to our scope tab, we don't see how it's actually restored any of the links. And that is another reason that, as I was discussing before, I really like having that report of the policy here in addition to just the settings for the policy, because this process does not restore the links of where that group policy was. And if you can't restore the links of the group policy, then that doesn't make restoring the policy all that useful, because you've only done half of the steps required to revert any changes done. So we do still need to go through and link that policy back to our location here. Again, it was originally called Workstation Settings. It's now called Restored Workstation Settings. And I'm going to go ahead and link that to our IT staff OU. And this means here that this policy is now back to its original status, linked to the same OUs with all the same settings, and we've completely undone the process of deleting the policy. One other note just to keep in mind is that importing of this policy here in no way, shape, or form affects any of the files that are actually in the export here. So you can go through this multiple times as needed or adjust things as needed, knowing that your export and your report are still going to remain intact. So I hope this helps to a lot of people out there that are going through and working in group policy. I know there's a lot of people that are afraid of consequences of making changes to group policy, and there's a lot of people just scared of group policy in general because doing it wrong can have far-reaching, very difficult consequences to resolve. But done properly, group policy is a very powerful management tool, and knowing how to manage group policy as well as being able to modify as needed, and most importantly, be able to revert changes if something goes bad, is a very critical component to managing group policy. And this method here of taking a report and exporting the policy allows you to have a little bit more peace of mind in modifying things, knowing that you can quickly and easily revert things back to its original status so easily. So I hope that this is useful to everyone. If you have any questions about this process, comments, think that there's a better way of doing any of this, definitely comment below. Otherwise, like, subscribe, and continue watching this channel here for more videos to assist IT staff, our heroes out there in the IT world of supporting our users. And I wish you all a wonderful day.